Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line from the Zaporizhia section of it in the south, where the Russians have made some advances to the south of the town of Kamyansk. The Russians also managed to advance in the southern western parts of the Donetsk region as well as east of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians in turn managed to regain control over the industrial area northwest of Toretsk, while the Russians continued advances west of the Serbis river line. The Ukrainians also continued their offensive operations into the Kursk region, where they have managed to gain a foothold in some forest lines just across the border area. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the central parts of the southern parts of Kamyansk, cutting off the Ukrainian positions here in the western parts. They're now operationally encircled with no road except for the one going across the river line, which is very difficult for the Ukrainians to supply across and is under direct fire control by the Russian forces, almost completely physically cutting it off, completely encircling the Ukrainian forces present within the residential area here in the western parts. The Russians managed to gain full control over the farm area to the southeast of Kamyansk and continue fighting along the north of Lubkova and in between Lubkova and Kamyansk, gaining control of several forest lines as well as the fortified positions east of the town as the Russians continued developments to gain full control of it by advancing along the positions here at the northeast, bypassing the river line and along the southern bank of it. The Russians also managed to advance here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region with several larger advances, along the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians managed to advance here north of Novy Komar along the river line, fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians east of the river line. The Russians also managed to gain control of the area in between Konstantinopol and Behatir, securing the farm area east of the town and expanding the zone of control between the two towns, connecting the crossings between Konstantinopol and Andrivka, and securing the area between Oleksivka and Behatir. The Russians have here completely secured the main supply line for the forces going into Behatir, improving the logistical situation for the Russian forces fighting within the town. The Russians also, with the capture of some of these fortified positions north of Dnipro in the area, are managing to secure the supply line for the forces into Vesele from the east and from the south, and also expanding along the main river line will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations towards Odratne and Komar here to the east of the Mokry Yeli river line. Further north, the Russians managed to advance within Hurova, gaining control over approximately half of the town, with the western and northern outskirts of it remaining under Ukrainian control, following which the Russians will gain control over the entire border area here west of Toretsk and Hurova. With this, the Ukrainian positions in Botanivka is completely isolated from any supply lines the Ukrainians have in the area. This weakens the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area, and the Russians will continue defensive operations to gain control over Hurova and Botanivka from the north and from the south. This will allow them to then start developments in the direction of the towns along the Vovcha river line and the fortified positions here to the south, and towards the main highway south of Novopavlivka, here across the border area. The Russians also managed to advance here west of Novoalexandrivka, gaining control over the forest lines and fields in between Novoalexandrivka and Novomykolaivka, reaching the outskirts of the town. Following the capture of the fortified positions, the Russians have managed to flatten the front line along the outskirts of the town, and with control over the southern bank of the river line, the Russians will continue fights over Novoserhivka to gain control over it, and cutting off the supply lines here to the south by moving into Novomykolaivka, isolating the two towns from each other, and start fighting over the fortified positions here to the west in near Moravka, cut off the supplies between Novomykolaivka and Moravka as well. The Russians are looking to gain full control over the border area from Novoserhivka in the north all the way down south to Hurova in the south. This will also allow the Russians to threaten the Ukrainian positions across the border area like Bilyakivka and in the direction of Novopavlivka, and cutting off the highway connecting the supplies to the south will allow the Russians to expand their control over the border area all the way to the towns along the Vovcha river line and down towards Odratne, following which fighting will take place over the pocket of settlements the Ukrainians have available behind this defensive line, which can be threatened from the east and from the south. The Russians will have a more difficult time gaining control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region than the areas they are currently fighting over, as the parts here further southwest have several fortified positions and larger concentrations of urban areas compared to the portion here further north. The portion here will allow the Russians to expand the supply lines for offensive operations here west of Pokrovsk. Allowing for additional supply lines further secures the supply lines, limiting the Ukrainian strike capabilities on the logistical routes for the Russians, and also allow the Russians to move across the border area and start fighting over logistical hubs such as Novopavlivka and Vyshova here along the main highways west of the city for further offensive operations further north for a future operational encirclement of the city of Pokrovsk. East of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions and forest patches here along the river line between Hrodivka and Myrolyubivka. The Russians crossed over from the canal area and managed to move upwards from Hrodivka, where we see this geolocated footage of the Russian forces fighting in the area. Fighting has likely ended over the fortified positions northwest of Hrodivka, but we have no confirmation of the developments there. But based on this development, it is likely that the Russians are moving here along the Kasani-Toretsk river line to gain control over both banks of it. This will allow the Russians to have that as a defensive line for the operational settlement of Pokrovsk from the east, where the Russians will like to gain control over the river line here, cutting off the main highway and having that as the frontline positions, and then moving onwards to capture the towns isolated from the defensive line of the Ukrainians further north. Near Toretsk, the Russians have lost their positions in the industrial area and away from the city itself. The Russians only had light vehicles and smaller groups of infantry moved across. Their largest concentration of forces were in the industrial area. Once the Ukrainians started hitting their supply lines, they were unable to support their forces there. As a result, they lost the industrial area, and this led to the Ukrainian recapture of the fortified positions here on the northwestern outskirts of the Toretsk area, which also removes the threat of a Russian encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the northeastern parts and in the southwestern parts of Toretsk, allowing for secure supply lines in these directions. While the forces of the Ukrainians here to the northeast, near Krimsk, are still operationally encircled, and it's only a matter of time before the Russians close that gap and gain full control over the area here near Krimsk. This will allow the Russians to restart offensive operations on the flanks of the Ukrainians with objectives of gaining control over the waste heaps and securing the northern parts and the southwestern parts of the city. Toretsk is one of the areas where the Ukrainians are concentrating some of their elite forces, similar to the Pokrovsk direction, where they continuously launch countertanks on Russian positions. The Russians sent reinforcements to deal with these forces. This is why there's been a lot of back and forth, but the Ukrainians have close proximity towards the city of Kościantinivka, while the city of Toretsk itself is within close proximity to Orelivka as well to the southeast. With this, both the Russians and the Ukrainians have significant urban areas close to Toretsk, and the area is heavily fortified as well. This means there's a lot of fire support for both sides. The Ukrainians have the high ground advantage here west of Toretsk, which they're making use of, combined with their fortified positions, allowing them to withstand Russian assaults. The Russians in this area do not have a significant upper hand like they have in other sections of the front line, like just west of Toretsk, where the Russians managed to gain control over significant portions of the front line, as well as several fortified positions, as well as here to the west of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have continuously advanced following the failure of the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area. The Russians are now on full offense, where they're looking to reach the border area and potentially cut off the supply lines of the Ukrainians in the area to develop offensive operations towards the encirclement of the city. We see that there are areas the Russians are prioritizing right now, which are areas here west of Toretsk and surrounding Pokrovsk, while the Ukrainians are counterattacking in the Toretsk direction, but also launching operations into the Kursk and Belgorod regions. West of the Serbis river line, the Russians managed to advance further within the town of Koledyasy, getting control over the forest line here to the north of the town, and further parts in the eastern parts of it. The Russians are here continuing offensive operations to gain full control over the town and the fortified positions around it. In the Kursk region, the Ukrainians, following several days of fighting, they also did not stop during the May 9th ceasefire period over the 3 days. The ceasefires the Russians have proposed generally do not involve the Russian side of the border, and therefore fighting never stops in the Russian side, whether it was during the Ukrainian Kursk incursion or now during the Belgorod and Kursk raids. The Ukrainians managed to secure a foothold across the border area, where they managed to gain control over several forest lines, both here east of Novi Put and to the west of the village. This is following about a week of fighting along the border area. The Russians have defensive lines along the border area, both here to the west and also to the east and to the south, where the Ukrainians continuously attempt to break through the Dragon Teeth lines, the trenches, and the anti-tank ditches that the Russians have prepared. This usually results in all of the armored vehicles being wiped out at the border crossing. The Ukrainians, despite this heavy resistance they're facing, continue their attempts. This is to prevent the Russians from launching their own offensive operations across the border area, limiting the offensive capabilities of their forces by forcing them to spread them out over a wider area. However, this has the same effect on the Ukrainians, where they're forced to send forces here to the north instead of defending against Russian offensive operations in the Donetsk region. And it is also a tactic that comes at a heavy cost, because they are driving headfirst into Russian defensive lines that are well fortified and well manned. These attacks are completely unsustainable, as we saw with the Belgorod region, where the Ukrainians just barely gained control over some border villages. Now they have lost control over all of them, and the Russians have managed to gain control over the town across into the Sumy region. We have seen the similar case here in the Kursk incursion. The Ukrainians lost their positions within the Kursk region, and the Russians entered the Sumy region. And they also have footholds within the Kharkiv region, despite the Ukrainians' attempts to enter the Belgorod region. So the Ukrainians continued their attempts to enter into Russian territory, but it is extremely unlikely that the Ukrainians will ever gain another Kursk incursion, even if they launch a large-scale offensive as they had previously, because the Russians are stopping them at the border. They have the border areas completely manned by active troops, and this is something that has held back the Russians from launching larger scale offensive operations in the south and the east. However, now the Russians have manned these positions, and the newer recruits will not be manning the border area, but instead they will be launching offensive operations in the east and in the south. This is what is allowing the Russians to launch these large scale sustainable offensive operations we have seen since the Kursk incursion. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.